Good morning, guys. Welcome. I wanted to clear a space here so that I can begin to find my voice and share with you some of the things that I'm most deeply passionate about and that I think you may be as well. The story of human evolution, the hero's journey, transformation, the development of consciousness, human development, integral theory, shadow work, leadership and organizational development. A few of our favorite people like Joseph Campbell, Carl Jung, Ken Wilber, Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, and of course people as well like Adyashanti, Byron Katie, Eckhart Tolle, and all of that as well in context of plant medicine, and even words like spirituality and religion, and what plant medicine is doing to help democratize mystical experience, or dare I say religious experience, the primary religious experience, the experience that gave rise to religion. I think this is where my heart is most alive today. I was reading some statistics, not just in Pollan's new book, How to Change Your Mind, but just in general on depression in the United States. They say 40 million people are depressed, and that may just be clinically speaking. That's 18% of the population. I believe you need to be 6 out of 10 qualifiers on a specific scale to qualify as depressed clinically. But as Dr. John Rady would say, who studied exercise and depression, he's like, what if you're just 5 out of 10? What are you then? Just miserable? So there's an epidemic, I think, in the modern era where, on the one hand, it's a dialectic of progress, as we say in integral theory. On the one hand, mortality rates, poverty rates, have all declined as a result of industrialization, capitalism, in the last 100 years. Literacy, cleanliness, the middle class. There are so many virtues of the evolution of the physical, the exterior of matter, and it helps keep us safer and more comfortable and more engaged. And yet, in the midst of, I see an image of the infrastructure just in terms of travel, transportation. We are more connected today and able to travel the globe, and yet imagine that image of a single individual amidst thousands of people in the Tokyo subway, for example, feeling even more alienated than if he had just been alone by himself. And so there's something striking about that kind of paradox, that visual paradox of swarming with people, yet someone feeling so alone. We're more connected by technology in the sense of communication, the internet and social media and video conferencing, practically holographic video conferencing at this point. And yet, do we still feel a lack of a sense of meaning or connectedness in spite of the material or technological capacity to connect? So the whole thing about the postmodern era, my parents' generation, the boomers that grew up after World War II and were responsible for what some would call the blossoming in human consciousness that was the 1960s, they have a critique. And I think it's very important here not to confuse academic postmodernism with the kind of spirit that actually emerged on the other side of modernity in the 1960s. Because ironically, we'll say, many of the people being critiqued by Jordan Peterson, for example, as quote-unquote postmodernists, are not actually at a postmodern stage of development. They're at a pre-modern stage of development, and they just subscribe to the postmodern worldview, and therein lies the problem, because a postmodern stage of development is actually not ideological. A pre-modern, pre-rational stage of development is expressly ideological. So you have a case where an earlier stage of development can adopt whatever worldview it wants. And so no wonder we have fundamentalist vegans, for example, or fundamentalist atheists, or fundamentalist academic postmodernists, Marxists. But the postmodern stage itself has everything to do with holding your own objective self-authoring as object, so that you can see it as but one of many perspectives, and that the perspectives that you experience cognitive dissonance with, actually, if you zoom out, they complete you in a way, in a systemic way, that you don't fully understand. But when you're onto yourself, that your truth isn't the only truth that's actually correct, and that one is relative to another, that kind of relativism, the capacity to think in both and terms instead of either or, that is what is meant by postmodernism. That the myth of the given, that the objective world is not merely awaiting our rational and objective observation of it, but that our subjective lenses, the filters that we use to observe reality, and the conclusions, the meaning making that then ensues, co-creates what we experience as reality. And that the journey into exploring those lenses, those biases, why you jump up the ladder of inference in the way you do to conclude what you do conclude, and the confirmation bias that exists within that as well, how I select the data that I want to see and then make it mean what I want to mean in order to confirm my own belief, my own worldview, my own bias. That kind of a self-reinforcing loop. It takes as much inner work, inquiry, to discover what those lenses are, to make those subjective lenses objects so that you can take them off and examine them, for you to know actually what the objective truth is. And that's the irony. I can only be as objective as I am aware of my subjective biases. And that's, it's ironic with Jordan Peterson, because you couldn't even begin to engage with depth psychology or go on a hero's journey into your own unconscious. And that's what it is implying, unless you are at a postmodern structure stage of development, psychologically speaking. So why is this so important? Because it comes back to this notion of spirituality and religion, and what plant medicine has to do with that, to me. So if you have a monological worldview, that there's only one way, one epistemology, one means of gaining and verifying knowledge, then you'll tend to be atheistic. Empiricism, data. Even the word data, it can mean multiple things, but only the things you can look at under a microscope are valid. And that's great. If you want to know what is inside of soil, like, put it under a microscope. But there are other ways of, there are different kinds of truth. So I think a very simple example would be, if you have a tree and you want to know what apples are made of, then, or the bark or the soil, then again, you can put that under the microscope and have an empirical answer. But if you want to have a discussion about who owns those trees, or who should be allowed to eat the fruit, then you have to arrive at a different kind of truth, and that's through meaning making, and that has to do with ethics. And that's a very different kind of truth. That's morality, not science. And then again, at that level, you can't put a statement of law underneath a microscope and glean anything from it. This is meaning making that is mental, that has to do with language and arriving at shared agreements, public agreements, social contract. Well, or not social contract if you're pre-modern. And then again, that's another way of arriving at what truth is. And the third way, We talk about the eye of flesh, the eye of reason, and the eye of spirit. Spiritual experience. You can't even use language to describe it. Paradox is sometimes the best you can do, or myth, symbols that have to be interpreted to glean the true meaning. Like Joseph Campbell talks about a symbol versus a sign. A sign points somewhere literal. A symbol represents something, and it doesn't make it any less true. So the eye of spirit has to do with inner experience. Now, what's interesting about all of this is all three of these are forms of science, because it involves having a hypothesis, designing an experiment, which has an injunction. Do this and observe, and collect data, draw conclusions, apply reasoning, and then come back to the community of the adequate and pressure test those answers to verify what indeed is or is not true, and hold above all the willingness to hold oneself and one's own biases as suspect. And so interesting again that just what we call the modern scientific method has controls designed into it to prevent drawing false conclusions or reinforcing biases, or as people weaponize science and use it to prove their own beliefs. It requires an objectivity that requires being in touch with your own subjectivity. And that, again, is a different stage of development. And if you are at an earlier stage of development, you indeed will weaponize science to confirm your own biases, even in the midst of control groups. Mark Twain said there are lies, damned lies, and then statistics. So we're all playing the game. You can see very mature, even rational or self-authoring people on both sides of the political spectrum, interpreting facts in such a way and arguing, advocating in favor of their own worldviews in quite a competent and mature way. What is the next step? It is inquiry, not just advocacy, but to balance advocacy and inquiry in service of being willing to uproot, again, your own biases, beliefs, the whole root system of why you see the world the way you do. And this invariably ties back to the realm of psychology. It's so interesting. You can't even begin to inquire why you think the way you do, or what proclivities you have on the basis of how you were raised, without looking at early childhood, the early childhood experiences, the formational developmental experiences, but as well as the wounding experiences. The two are inseparable. They co-create your reality. And unless or until you're willing to explore emotional triggers, the things that hijack your brainstem so that you misinterpret a verbal threat, for example, as a literal threat to your physical existence, as if a lion were chasing you, this whole space of emotional intelligence, unless or until you're willing to explore into that territory, how can you even begin to know that what you see is real, that your truth is objective, and there isn't something that you might have missed, like a blind spot when you play a sport? They don't call it the unconscious for nothing. And so here entered the whole notion of the shadow and the unconscious. And what got you here won't get you there. The way that self-systems, either psychologically, culturally, even civilizations, tend to anchor around a certain center of gravity. And sure, that culture will evolve people or grow people up to it, but then it also tends to pull people down from escaping it, either on the basis of social conformity or just individual peer pressure that happen, which is, I guess, the mechanism of conformity. So to be willing in the first place in a materialistic society to do inner work, to explore these alternate means of gaining knowledge, and to even assert that meaning-making, hermeneutics, and let alone mysticism, spiritual experience of higher states of consciousness, that those subjective means or interpersonal means of establishing what is true are valid, well, good luck with that, given the modern establishment. There's a beautiful movie, which is also a psychological thriller, sci-fi film called Annihilation. I highly recommend it. Natalie Portman, same director as Ex Machina, if you've seen that one. But all I can say that the movie is about, the premise is that an asteroid crashes into Earth, quite poetically, at the basis of a lighthouse it lands. And it creates this bubble that they call the shimmer. And multiple SEAL teams have been sent inside the shimmer and have not returned, save for one individual who is quite altered as a result. And his wife is Natalie Portman. And basically, as a nod to feminism and postmodernism, if we can call it that at this point, they send a team of 4 women in to explore what's happening. And all the genes are splicing inside of the shimmer. And then, of course, they begin to notice that their own genes at a subcellular level are also beginning to be infiltrated by whatever this alien force is. And that's the very interesting metaphor that the film creates as things evolve, is that in a materialistic worldview, that spirit is such a foreign thing. Just the notion of spirit in action as the force of evolution, that it may as well be an alien force. If we discovered that there were even a patch of grass or a single-celled organism on another planet, our minds would be blown. It would throw a wrench in the works of our whole, human-centric view of the universe, especially for fundamentalists or people hailing from a religious worldview. But there is life around us. There is life around us right now. You are alive. And we have no idea how any of it got here. No idea. That is the miracle of why is there something rather than nothing? And that science cannot explain. Not even where did everything come from. And yet when you get locked into this mindset, you miss the mystery. And that mystery, if anything, and even the spirit of science itself, rationally seeking to know the truth, would we not try any means by which we might know the truth and to know it for ourselves? Any means available. So on this basis, I would assert that, as I believe, who was it that said the telescope is to astronomy and the microscope is to biology, as plant medicine, as psychedelics are to exploring the mind and human consciousness. That is a big statement, and I think Timothy Leary was one of the people who said that, but it goes back further than him. So take that in for a moment. And then look to the research being done at Johns Hopkins University. I had the privilege of speaking with Dr. Roland Griffiths about that research. And it's the research that came out and was featured in the New Yorker article by Michael Pollan back in 2015, incidentally the same month as I had my first experience. And this article summed up the research to say they take healthy human beings, healthy normals as they call them, off of the street, and they have a single dose of psilocybin with specific directions around set and setting. Set refers to your mindset, so it's an intentional space, and people feel committed to going into an inward journey. And the setting is a supportive, comfortable environment. There's minimalist music and eye mask. There are 2 guardians in the space for each person, or 1 or 2, and they're invited to go within and let the medicine take them on a journey. And having studied the results just subjectively on a questionnaire about mystical experience, 80% of the people who have a single journey with psilocybin report that it was one of the 5 most significant spiritual experiences of their life, including the birth of a child, the death of a loved one, or anything religious or spiritual that they had partaken in. 20% say it is the single defining mystical experience of their life. So if that doesn't cause you pause, then I will add the following. In the article, the trip treatment in the New Yorker does a very good job of helping expand your perspective about this. I was raised as a meditator, which means I had the meditator's bias about all things that would be lumped into the category of drug. But think about this for a minute. These natural plant-based medicines grow out of the ground all over the earth. They have been utilized in native ceremonies with tribal peoples for thousands of years of recorded history, and who knows how long, before that. Now, it's important rationally to make a distinction, because why were people originally using these medicines? If you go back to the history of Maria Sabina, who was the medicine woman curandera in Oaxaca with the Mazatlan people that was holding that tradition, use of the mushrooms, she would say originally people came to heal and to talk to God. And if you talk to someone from Oaxaca, they'll say, oh yes, I was healed once as a child. They were healed. They didn't trip. They didn't get high. This is not the use of the medicine as a drug. And that is the other word for it, is medicine. So let's just look at that. What is a drug? Notwithstanding that, of course, there's brain chemistry going on when you take these medicines, but an opioid or a benzo, what does that do? What is its function? It's to mask symptoms, which actually is what perpetuates the addiction cycle, where if you don't treat the root cause, the symptoms just come back. That's the definition of addiction, and that's what drugs do. A medicine, on the other hand, heals, and at a root cause level, which can actually prevent addiction to drugs. So that, for me, is what allowed me to separate drug from medicine, and plant-based medicine as well. So you look at the other uses of psilocybin in modern-day America here. Smoking cessation. I even believe it was up to 70 or 80% success rate with three treatments and 3 cognitive behavioral therapy sessions, which is a lot like coaching, for use with end-of-life cancer patients losing their fear of death. Alcoholism, heroin, I think those research studies are being done now. And, when you look especially at these mental health issues, they often describe even alcoholism as not just an emotional or psychological problem, but as a spiritual problem. And it's important to make this distinction because different treatments work at different levels. And what does it mean that it's a spiritual problem? It's an existential problem, a loss of meaning or a fundamental loss of trust in life, and in life in the face of death. So this highlights something really important, that there is a unified field theory of mental illness, as Paulin says. Of course, it's obvious to see that anxiety and depression are related because one worries about the future and one laments about the past. But even in my own experience, and this is someone who was raised with transcendental meditation, got into integral psychology, got into things like Zen and Buddhism along with TM, was also raised Jewish, and grew up in kind of an interfaith yet Jewish environment with Sunday school and everything, and got into all the inner work modalities, the work of Byron Katie, the different forms of inquiry, nonviolent communication, cognitive behavioral therapy, immunity to change. There's so many modalities, and I thought of myself as integral. And yet, all those years of doing that kind of coaching and inner work didn't touch into the deepest levels. In the Hindu system, the lower chakras, the root of the problem. And so, yes, there is a unified field theory of mental illness because, if you're physically sick, you go to a doctor. Great. If you have emotional or mental problems, you go to a counselor, therapist, coach. And sometimes they talk about the psychosomatic causation of physical illness. So you can have physical symptoms on the basis of, simply put, stress, but also more acute things that, this is what somatic psychology studies as well. Specific types of thought patterns and early childhood experiences lead to specific physical ailments. And that's a really interesting field and worth a whole conversation on its own, as there can be quite a bit of woo that gets mixed up in there. But just in terms of direct causation, it's pretty easy to see that if we worry a lot, sometimes there's something that happens. You get a headache or your stomach hurts because you experience your emotions in different parts of your body. But there's one more level that you can go upstream, and this is to get to the root of it. And some would say this is the core wound that we all carry. And I would put it in this way: who cares if you remodel the third floor of your house if the foundation is broken? If underneath whatever psychological suffering you're experiencing or emotional trauma as a result of something, particular thing that happened to you in your life, if you do fundamentally not trust life in the face of death, if underneath it all you have some existential issues, between you and your maker, or however you got here, then who cares if one thing goes one way or another? You can be asleep or unconscious to this core wound for most of your life, but when you age and people start dying around you, it can become very painful all at once, and that scab gets ripped off, and suddenly you're faced with what's the meaning of anything if we're just going to die and cease to exist. Now, some people even manage to rationally compensate very well and show up as incredibly mature, and they seem to have reconciled or be okay with the fact that they're not going to exist. No one noticed before you were here, and maybe no one will notice after you're gone, but life itself continues, and I'm just going to keep my chin up, keep calm, and carry on. That's just the way it is. I would still argue that underneath that rationality, there's something precious that's been buried. And whether you choose to confront that or not in your lifetime, it's still present. So what's the point? The point is that plant medicine, these medicines, help you heal the core wound. And the core wound is something that I want to speak to for a minute more. When religions speak about original sin, in the first place, sin just means to miss the mark. So if you have a value system, whatever that value system is, to not walk your own talk, to say you value something, but then not to honor it, and to be willing to look at that and say, I missed the mark. That is the structure of reflection, of confession. And people mistake the traditional morality of religion, the content, in other words, of religion, for its structure, for the structure that religion serves. And it serves two different structures, actually. The first is of providing us with mystical experience, spiritual experience. The word religare, re-lig, means to bind back or to reconnect, or to go over again would be another definition. And so we might extend that to say to reconnect or bind back to the source. Someone thousands of years ago or hundreds of years ago, or maybe living today, had a genuine mystical or religious experience that led normally to their founders wanting to create a religion around them. Now, the second part of the spiritual dimension of religion is the moral, the law, that with an awakening to your true nature, to your source, and the truth of that comes that which is good, and the law that helps us to embody and live out our true nature. Now, again, it is my belief that religions have crystallized a Bronze Era morality because we have become disconnected from the fountain, the font of mystical experience that gave rise to religion in the first place. So if that experience was filtered through a traditional consciousness, then it results in traditional morality. That was the cutting edge of the day. But because we have ceased to continue reconnecting with our source and knowing for ourselves what the truth is, then our morality has not gotten an update in a little while, and we're playing a 5,000-year-old game of telephone. And this is the point. You don't have to believe a word I say. This is the injunction. Perform the experiment yourself. Don't you want to know the truth for yourself? This is the mystical core of every religion, regardless of what wrongs it has done in the name of God. Gnosis. Mystical Christianity is called Gnosticism, at least one of its branches. Gnosis, to know, not with your intellect, but to know by experience, directly. This is what democratizes the religious experience. This is what democratizes our relationship to guru or priest. There is no need anymore for an intermediary if you can have your own experience. And there is a meritocracy in this. For those who have chosen to perform the experiment and go up the mountain, if you will, people go up the mountain to varying extents. We're more or less evolved. There's a natural hierarchy that emerges. And that we can also commit to life practices, psychologically and spiritually, that allow us to grow as individual human beings. And that if we commit to those practices day to day, week to week, we grow in our capacity then to access or to go further up the mountain in our journeys. So those vertical deep dives, those experiences, those mystical experiences, peak state experiences, religious experiences, then we can come back and integrate those into our day-to-day life in service of realizing more of our potential, awakening to who we are and embodying it in action consistently, and maintaining the kind of presence or spirit that begins to emerge when we go on these journeys. That is, some would say, the result of the evolutionary process. Just scientifically first, that we're born of the body and we are animals first with, or reptiles really first with brain stems and just basic fight or flight responses. And then we evolve somehow a limbic brain that experiences emotions and care and loyalty in mammals. And then this third thing evolves, which is a cerebral cortex that becomes capable of reflexive reasoning and reflection itself, contemplation, and that is capable of having mystical experiences. If that isn't radical enough, then think of it in terms of we're born of the body, here we are alive. We're born of the mind, which some would say is the moment we're kicked out of the garden, metaphorically, and we know we're going to die now, and so we can contemplate our demise, which can lead either to making what we have meaningful or to a lot of nihilism and existential depression. But then something else begins to happen in human evolution, is that we begin to be born of the spirit. And through meditation practices, the cultivation of mindfulness, and through these journeys, you awaken to what some call the living presence, the awareness that it's always now. And something pops out that begins to watch you. You disidentify with the ego, the mind-made self, the storied self, the who I am that I believe myself to be in relationship to everyone else and to society and to life. I am Nathaniel. I am a man. I am Jewish. I am 38 years old. I am a coach. I am a CEO. All these stories. I have a sister. I have parents, their names are what they are. I am not that. And Annihilation, the movie, is beautiful at speaking about this, because our cells are programmed to actually self-destruct. And so what if all of this physical evolution, billions of years, 14.5 billion years, has occurred so that we could evolve a body, we could evolve a mental ego, and so that mental ego could self-destruct, and that something else, the spirit, could emerge. Regardless of religion or traditional fundamentalist belief system, there is a through line, a mystical through line, that is human seeking, and that is human goodness. And good that we have modernity and science and progress, and good that we use that same mindset to cross-train and explore psychological and spiritual practices to see what genuinely is the most reliable for accessing mystical experience, and what it means amongst a community of the adequate to embody those experiences. Because a state experience is just that, very different when a temporary state can become an enduring trait. Like the old joke goes, the old couple that stops on the street to ask for directions, they say, "How do you get to Carnegie Hall?" And someone says, "Practice." So the evolution of human consciousness, there's no magic pill. And yet, with those experiences, so that you can open the doors of perception, as Aldous Huxley would say, so that you can know the trajectory of human evolution for yourself, and where you came from and who you are, and that you can adopt practices in day-to-day life to live more fully into that B'Tselem Elohim, that we were created in the image and likeness of God. Whatever that word means to you, like where everything came from. Even in Hebrew, you don't pronounce the name of God. It is the Tao that cannot be named, and the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. Yud He Vav He is just the what was, what is, and what always will be, the mystery. And yet it said it's also alive, the living presence. There's another symbol for God, and when God speaks to Moses, in the symbol of a burning bush. And that is most meaningful to me, because as Joseph Campbell inquires in a kind of Western koan, what is that which is eternally consuming itself, yet which itself is never consumed? And you know what the purpose of a koan is. It's to use the rational to transcend the rational. It points out to something beyond, to the trans-rational, to what is awake and immanent now. And the now is that which is eternally consuming itself, yet which itself is never consumed. The living presence. Much more to say. I will leave you with that and begin to sew it together by going deeper into some of these topics that I just touched on. And hopefully, if you resonate with this, like the channel, share it with your friends, repost, and let me know any comments or questions. What is your experience with plant medicine? What is your experience of doing spiritual practices like meditation without psychological work? Or what if you've only gone to therapy, you've only had a coach, or been a leader in a business, had leadership development, but you've never really taken up spiritual practice, let alone something like plant medicine? What is your experience in terms of how you put these practices together? I look forward to hearing from you, and blessings be.